Merry Christmas. It is Christmas Eve, 11:21 p.m., and I will be covering the Italian Renaissance with terrible video quality for now, and I will remake this video once I can obtain a video camera of high quality. But I need to practice. I need to go over my notes, so I'm going to do this. Okay, so the Italian Renaissance. Now, Renaissance is French for rebirth, okay? But of course, we're talking about the Italian Renaissance. Now, Europe had just been through the Middle Ages, which the humanists referred to as the Dark Ages. And what was the light before the Dark Ages? The period of the Greeks and the Romans. The Renaissance was, in part, a rebirthing of classical antiquity, a rediscovery of the works of great thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero. Now, the High Renaissance took place between 1450 and 1527. Now, again, we're focusing on Italy now, which at the time was comprised of small city-states that were for the most part republics. That is, they were not monarchies; they were republics. Now let's look at some of the causes of the Renaissance. The driving forces of the Italian Renaissance. One, of course, obviously was Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in 1454. But we should note that that's 4 years after the beginning of the Italian Renaissance, and this allowed for writings of all types to be more widely distributed, and there was a rise in literacy, and also scholars had access to more writings, and obviously to works of classical antiquity. There was Italian commerce. Patrons like the Medici family could afford to fund scholars and artists. And then there was the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Turks closed down Christian universities, and Greek scholars were forced to flee to Italy with many ancient texts that were previously unavailable in Italy. The Italians welcomed these Greek scholars with open arms, and a part of this, and as a result, Plato's complete texts were translated from Greek into Latin for the first time, so that more scholars could read them. So the Italian scholars were able to read the works of Plato and other scholars. Obviously, other ancient texts were also translated from Greek into Latin. Let's see, and what were the driving values of the Renaissance? One was humanism. This is based on classical studies. Humanism is literally the study of humanity. I'm sure you're all familiar, if you ever attended college, you're familiar with the humanities. It was a term first coined by Cicero during the Roman period. It described the education of a cultivated human being. So literature, grammar, history, art, philosophy, etc. And the main focus for humanism at the time was on the study of Greek, Roman, and biblical literature, with an emphasis on studying them in their original language. For instance, Latin, Greek, Hebrew. Now there had to be Christian justifications for reading this, and there was precedent for the study of classical literature that could satisfy the Catholic Church. For example, Saint Basil the Great of the 4th century said wrote that it was okay to study Greek literature as long as it was making you a better Christian. And Saint Thomas Aquinas of the 13th century attempted to reconcile the works of Aristotle with the teachings of Christianity. Though we should note that the works of Aristotle were subordinate. They were complementary. He considered them complementary to the teachings of Christianity, but subordinate to them. and this will contrast with Petrarch of the 14th century, who is often referred to as the father of humanism. He had an obsession with ancient Rome. He actually rediscovered deteriorating. Sorry, it's late and I'm tired. Deteriorating Latin texts, including some of the works of Cicero. He also referred to the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, since they had forgotten the classical texts of the Rome and Greece. His most famous poem was called Africa. A little bit more about Petrarch. Um, his most famous poem is called Africa. It tells the story of the Second Punic War, in which the Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded Italy, but Roman forces were eventually victorious after an invasion of North Africa led by Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the epic poem's hero. And for writing this poem, Petrarch won the title of Poet Laureate. His other famous work was the Canzoniere. It was mostly sonnets. It was written in the common vernacular, since they were love poems, and women mostly read love poems, and it was mostly written to a woman called Laura. Now, it's debatable whether this woman was actually real or not. She could have simply been a metaphor for the ideal woman of the Renaissance. She was described as beautiful, chaste, virtuous. So, we may never know whether or not Laura was actually real or not. Not sure why that's important, but it's in the textbook. Then there was secularism. The art and artists of the Renaissance were still Christian. Well, the artists at the time were still Christian, but the Renaissance thinkers were not focused on religion when engaged in their studies. They read the classical works for their own enjoyment and education, but at the same time they were not anti-religious or irreligious. That is, they weren't against religion, and they were not without religion. But they were simply human-centered in their thinking when studying these classic texts, rather than religious-centered in their thinking, like St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Basil the Great of the 4th century. It's only during the Enlightenment that you start seeing anti-religious thinkers arise to prominence. Now, some key figures of the Italian Renaissance. These are all very important if you're going to be taking the AP European exam. There is Pico della Mirandola, 1463. He lived from 1463 to 1494. He read Plato's works and was heavily influenced by them. He wrote Oration on the Dignity of Man, and this is often referred to as the Manifesto of the Renaissance, though that's not his official title. The thesis is essentially that human beings are a miracle and that they have a choice. They can rise to the level of angels or devolve to the level of humans. Angels and animals do not have this choice. They are simply angels. Angels are simply angels, and animals are simply animals. They do not have that free will. And through 900 theses, he attempted syncretism. That is, he attempted to reconcile classical works with the teachings of Christianity. But unlike St. Thomas Aquinas, he gave them equal importance. Now, if you mention the Oration on the Dignity of Man in your FRQs for the AP Euro exam, when you have a question about the Italian Renaissance, you will have a higher score. So it's good to remember that. The Oration on the Dignity of Man, often referred to as the Manifesto of the Renaissance. Part of the Italian Renaissance was Machiavelli. He He was born and he died in Florence, Italy, which was at the heart of the Italian Renaissance. And of course, he's most famous for writing *The Prince*. It was written ostensibly for princes and other monarchs on how to rule. It was based on the philosophy, put simply, that the ends justify the means. He advised that a monarch should do whatever it takes to accomplish his goals, regardless of whether or not the means are morally right or wrong. He argued in *The Prince* that, quite famously, that it is better to be feared than loved. But people often forget that he also advised that rulers should avoid being hated, since hate can spur rebellion. Why did he say that it's better to be feared than to be loved? Well, he said that someone who loves you may betray you, but someone who fears you will not. And he also wrote that the ideal is for a monarch to be both loved and feared. Though if he had to choose between one or the other, better to be feared than loved. Now, a lot of history textbooks sort of gloss over this and don't mention it at all, but there's contention on whether Machiavelli meant this to be taken seriously or if it was a work of satire. It was a relatively short pamphlet in comparison to all his other works, and his writings are quite voluminous. I swear to God, when I redo this video, I don't know how to say that word. Voluminous. There are a lot of volumes. In all his other works, which there are many, he advocated for a republican government, a republican form of government. That is, for a republic, a free government. He was always known as a staunch Republican, and in his Discorsi, he argued for a free government quite strongly, and he argued against monarchies. Furthermore, *The Prince* was written in the common vernacular, that is Italian, so that everyone could read it. You would think that if he meant it only for monarchs, he would have written it in Latin and not published it publicly. Though perhaps he wanted the people of Italy to advocate for the type of absolutist monarch he described in *The Prince*, so that the ruler would have support. So it is of course possible that Machiavelli had a change of heart regarding his former republicanism, and that the prince was to be taken literally, but historians may never know for certain. Though it would seem to me that most historians interpret it as being earnest rather than a work of satire. And of course, the type of ruler described by Machiavelli could very well unite Italy, which is something that Machiavelli may have wanted. Later, Otto von Bismarck of Germany would use Machiavellian methods, which he referred to as realpolitik, to unite Germany. Thus, it is quite possible that Otto von Bismarck was influenced by the prince and used the Machiavellian philosophy as described in *The Prince* successfully to unite Germany. Another important Italian Renaissance figure is Baldassare Castiglione, who was born in 1478 and died in 1529. He was the Count of Castico, an Italian courtier, a diplomat, a soldier, and a prominent Renaissance author, most famous for his authorship of the Book of the Courtier. The work was an example of a courtesy book, dealing with questions of etiquette and morality of the courtier, and it was very influential in 16th century European court circles. Now, a courtier is a person who's often in attendance at the court of a king or another royal personage. Then, finally, there's Lorenzo de' Medici, who lived from 1449 to 1492. Also, at the time, he was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was an Italian statesman and the de facto ruler of the Florentine Republic, and was one of the most politically powerful and enthusiastic patrons of the Renaissance. Also known as, yeah, okay, I already said that. Also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent by contemporary Florentines. He was a magnate, a diplomat, a politician, and a patron of scholars, artists, and poets. He is well known for his contribution to the art world by sponsoring artists such as Botticelli and Michelangelo. His life coincided with the mature phase of the Italian Renaissance, and his death coincided with the end of the Golden Age of Florence. The fragile peace that he helped maintain among the various Italian states collapsed with his death, and so did the Medici Bank, because he was not magnificent at managing the Medici Bank. He spent more time focusing on maintaining peace among Italy and on the Renaissance than he did on managing the Medici Bank. Unlike his grandfather Cosimo de' Medici, who was brilliant at finance. So 2 years after his death, the Medici Bank collapsed. Now a little about the Medici Bank. It was a financial institution created by the Medici family in Italy during the late 14th century. It was founded in 1397 and it collapsed in 1494. That is 2 years after the death of Lorenzo de' Medici. It was the largest and most respected bank in Europe during the 15th century. There are some estimates that the Medici Bank was, for a period, the Medici family was, for a period of time, the wealthiest family in Europe, though it is kind of difficult to accurately measure these sort of things. At the very least, they were one of the wealthiest families in Europe. The Medici Bank, the Medicis, well, they actually found ways to charge interest at the time, despite the Catholic Church's ban on usury, by not charging interest directly. For example, they might lend to a merchant in return for lower prices on their products, or they might provide a loan in one currency and demand repayment in another currency, and there was a hidden rate of interest in the exchange rate. Now I'll wrap up part 1 on the Italian Renaissance. Thank you for watching. Though I doubt anyone actually would watch this. I wouldn't watch it. Terrible quality, and look at this. But anyway, I'm going to over my notes, and I promise to make a video every day regarding some historical subject, and hopefully in the future, as I go on, the quality will improve. So thank you for watching, and Merry Christmas to you. Have a great holiday. I am tired.